Good afternoon, everybody. Our session here is part of a long-run study we're making at Hoover that stems from our observation that the world is changing rapidly and radically. So we're trying to understand that better and figure out what to do about it. So we've had two sessions so far, one on Russia and one on China. Many of you may have been here. And at the same time as all this is going on, there's obviously a need for governance. And we see that the problem of governance is increasingly complicated. So we had a discussion of that today, and the chairman and the panelists are here today. The chairman is Hoover Fellow Condoleezza Rice, former Secretary of State, and she'll introduce the panelists and chair the session. Condi?
Well, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for what we hope will be a very stimulating and interesting discussion. I'm joined on stage by my colleague, senior fellow at the Hoover Institution, Niall Ferguson, an historian of considerable note, and our colleague from Harvard University, Joe Nye, who is also visiting at Hoover from time to time, and so we very much look forward to our conversation. I want to just start by thanking Secretary Shultz and Jim Temby, who are running this project on the problems of the new era. And I want to thank them for particularly putting a focus on issues of governance, because it's very clear that across the world, in whatever setting, governments are having trouble connecting to their people, they're having trouble delivering for their people. In almost every country, you are seeing a crisis of confidence in institutions, particularly in liberal democracies. And so our task today is to talk about one aspect of this problem of legitimacy, problem of confidence, and that is what is the impact on the way that we get our information, the speed with which we get our information, what is the impact of information technology on a democracy, and should we think of it as a challenge as well as an opportunity? And so what we're going to do is that for 40 minutes or so, 45 minutes, the panelists here are going to bat around some questions and some concepts that they've both written very good papers for the conference that we're holding. But then we're going to open it up to you and ask you to join in the conversation. I am a professor. If nobody raises their hand, I will cold call. So please get your questions ready. So with that, let me just say that we just had a very interesting discussion of social media, election interference through social media and cybersecurity. And we were reflecting on the fact that if we'd had a session 10 years ago on the challenges to democracy, we might have talked about how young democracies have difficulty holding free and fair elections. We might have talked about how young democracies coming out of civil conflict try to deal with those who have been a part of the conflict. In other words, how they try to end wars and to reintegrate people. We might have talked about the problems of democracies when they are faced with the challenges of ethnic division. We might have even talked about how democracies do or do not deliver for their people. We probably would not 10 years ago have thought to talk about the challenge of cybersecurity and what has happened in elections across the United States and Europe with the interference of external powers in those elections through technological platforms. And so I'm going to start with a question, and I'd like Joe, perhaps you'll start, and then we can have a conversation. Maybe Neil, you can respond. We know that information used or weaponizing of information has been with us for a very, very long time. But we're seeing something different. How is social media, how are the technologies that we're employing now, how's it changed the information age and the interaction between states and, in fact, the weaponization of information?
Well, if you go back to the end of the Cold War in the 90s, when the World Wide Web was just getting really established, what's intriguing is how optimistic we all were. We finally slain the ghost of George Orwell, and the internet was going to make people free. President Clinton famously said that in China, trying to control the internet was like nailing Jell-O to the wall. Well, the Chinese have proven pretty good at nailing Jell-O to the wall. And the asymmetries in which we thought authoritarians were at a disadvantage and democracies with our openness were an advantage, those asymmetries have more or less been reversed. The authoritarians have been able to close themselves off relatively successfully, and the democracies have been suffering from penetration of our system, a lot of it through the weaponization of social media. It's the big American companies, Facebook, Google, and so forth, which the Russians learned how to turn into a weapon to penetrate our system, and that had such an effect on the 2016 events and the election. And so there is a big change, and the change has been to our disadvantage as democracies. But I think the interesting thing, to put it in the context of your question, Condi, is information warfare is not new. We've done it, the Russians have done it, everybody's done it. I mentioned in our earlier discussion that since it's 100 years ago that we're celebrating the end of World War I, to notice that the British cut the German cables as one of their first transatlantic cables, as one of their first acts of war in 1914, and controlled the flow to the United States of information. And then they fed us the Zimmermann telegraph, which was an intercept of a German communication, slightly, the timing and context was slightly off, and it helped to push the Americans into the war on the British side. So there's a democracy manipulating another democracy through information, and we did it in the Cold War, and so forth. But what's really different now is if you were going to use information as a weapon in the Cold War, let's say, as we did, you had to train a spy, you had to get cover for the spy, you had to, I don't know, have you seen the TV series The Americans, about Russians who were trained to live as Americans? That's expensive, to train all these people, to get them good cover, housing, and so forth. And when they get caught, they're shipped back home, you lose your whole investment. If you send an electron across the border in a phishing email and it's rejected, nobody clicks on it, you lose an electron. So you send another electron, and you can do that at no cost at all. So the cost of this information warfare has gone down very, very low. The other thing, of course, is speed. And there, a great example is in the 1980s, the Russians in 1983 launched a campaign starting with a little magazine in India that said the American military at Fort Detrick had unleashed HIV virus because they wanted to infect African Americans with AIDS. And it took 4 years between that publication in India and when it was picked up in the mainstream press in Europe and the United States for that to circulate. When in the 2016 election, when you had the so-called Pizzagate episode, which said that Hillary Clinton was running some sort of a child sex ring at a pizza restaurant in Washington, that was almost instantaneous. I mean, that was all over the internet right away. And so there's a fantastic difference in cost and speed of information warfare in the cyber age, and what we had assumed was our natural advantage as a democracy of being open has actually been used against us. So those are some pretty big differences.
And Neil, do you want to respond to Joe or comment?
Yeah, well, I think this is fascinating because the changes are in some ways even more recent than Joe implies. You don't need to go back to the 1990s. You only need to go back to the 2008 election. In that election, it was a kind of novelty that Barack Obama was on something called Facebook. That was still a relatively recent thing. And if you look at the numbers, the number of people who were following him was really quite small. Whereas 8 years later, the most striking difference in the public sphere in the United States was the enormous growth of Facebook as a network platform, Twitter, the increased reliance of users on Google search, the enormous growth of YouTube. The public sphere in the United States dramatically changed in its structure in somewhat less than a decade. And the difference between our papers, which I think are complementary to one another, is that Joe's looks at the ways in which that rapid change has created new vulnerabilities for democracies, new opportunities for foreign actors to interfere in the democratic process. And my paper looks at the real failure of domestic regulation to manage this transformation and to create any kind of protection for the democratic system. So I think these papers need to be read together because we're dealing here with two distinct problems, one of which is how do you protect the public sphere from external threats like the Russian interference in 2016, which, as you say, Condi, would have been unimaginable just 10 years or even 8 years earlier. And then the separate set of questions, which I think in some ways are more burning, which have to do with how our nation state regulates giant near monopoly companies that scarcely existed or were just fledglings 10 years ago.
We'll come back to the question of regulation or non-regulation of the companies that have built these platforms, because one of the differences in this quote-unquote threat to democracy is that the infrastructure is not owned by any government. It's in fact owned by the private sector, and so that raises a number of important issues. But I want to continue to press a little bit on this question of the vulnerability of democracy to the manipulation of information or to the weaponization of information, however you'd like to phrase it. One of the things that people are concerned about is that in liberal democracies, you're seeing the rise of what I've called in a recent book, the four horsemen of the apocalypse: populism, nativism, isolationism, and protectionism. And there's a sense in which the ability to get people to go to their own tribes, if you will, to feel aggrieved because somehow they've not been treated well economically, culturally, whatever, that it's exacerbated by the way that one gets information, by the fact that you can stay within your group. You don't actually have to encounter someone who thinks differently. When I'm going to now expose my age, but when I was a kid, my family watched the Huntley-Brinkley Report. Maybe some people watched Walter Cronkite, other people watched Howard K. Smith, but we had essentially the same view, the same moonshot, the same Vietnam War, the same civil rights movement. Now, I can go to my website, I can go to my cable news channels, I can go to my bloggers. In social media, I can talk to people who reinforce my views. And there's a sense that this kind of echo chamber is another threat to democracy because it causes us not to talk across our political differences or to engage in what was called by the founders constant contestation of ideas. We don't contest ideas, we simply go to our corners. So can you talk a little bit about that as one of the other vulnerabilities of democracy, not just in exploitation by foreign powers, but also just as a central vulnerability of the way we organize ourselves?
One of the fascinating features of American political discourse is that there are really two mutually antagonistic camps, one broadly liberal and one broadly conservative. And this goes back a long way. You could have said the same of cable TV when it came into its own. And so you have four horsemen of the apocalypse, populism, etc. But I could have my four horsemen, which would be globalism, multiculturalism, political correctness. You know, it's perfectly possible to construct an alternative set of demons. I think what's happened with the advent of the network platforms is different, though, because they not only express the polarization, they accentuate it and they exacerbate it. And there are very good technical reasons for that, which I talk about in the paper.
Why don't you talk a little bit about that? Because that's the important point.
This is the crux. And yes. I think it's important, if anybody says to you, nothing new under the sun, we've seen all this before, it was just the same, and they pick a decade. The answer is it's not the same. Polarization, measured in any number of ways, has increased in the last 20 or so years. It's got especially bitter in the last few years. Jonathan Haidt has a good chart showing that the level of hatred of the other party, the people who are willing to say they hate the other major party, has gone up substantially in a relatively recent time frame. And the reasons for that are, I think, twofold. Number one, the public sphere is now dominated by a very few companies. 80% of Americans consume news, roughly speaking, via referral from either Google or Facebook. These companies are concerned primarily with maximizing your engagement with their platforms, because by showing that you're engaged by their platforms, they can sell advertising, which is how they make money. And you, because of strange heuristic biases that seem to be part of the human psyche, are more likely to be engaged by extreme views and fake news than by the boring old truth. And there is now really a quite substantial body of scholarship showing that the network platforms, the algorithms that they employ, accentuate the polarization. Example, if you go to YouTube and you want to see a video about the Pope, then the suggestions bar will give you, 9 other videos about the Pope, each closer to a crazy conspiracy theory than the one you first viewed. So the way YouTube functions, this has been well documented, is to push you out along the political spectrum from perhaps the center right or center left where you began to the far right or far left. And I could multiply those examples. I would describe the network platforms as presently constituted as engines not just of confirmation bias. We've heard this a lot, you just alluded to it, the filter bubble or echo chamber phenomenon. It's worse than that. They don't just put you in a filter bubble and keep you there. They want to move you out along the spectrum, because the more out there you are, oddly enough, the more engaged you tend to be. The most extreme people tweet the most about politics. That's something that's very striking from Twitter data. I'll give you one more example and then I'll stop. There are plenty more in the paper. If you're into Twitter and you tweet about politics, for every one moral or emotive word you use, your tweet is 20% more likely to be retweeted. So research shows that we've created, inadvertently, it wasn't the goal was just engagement, but we've created in Silicon Valley network platforms that are accentuating the divisions in our society in a way that I think is profoundly dangerous, because after a certain point, violence of language starts to create an appetite for actual violence. That's what I find most disturbing about the way that social media and politics are now interacting. And not only in America. This is a global phenomenon because these network platforms are global.
Joe?
Well, I agree with what Niall said, that the business models of the social media encourage attention, and what gets attention is outrage. In other words, why is it that fake news gets more clicks than real news? Because it usually has something outrageous in the title, and people click on outrage. So it's not as though the heads of these companies say, oh, I really want to foment more anti-Semitism. That's very implausible. But their algorithm, after it takes you one step, then takes you another step and another step, before you know it, you're on an anti-Semitic website. And so there's something about the machinery, if you want, of what we've created of financing these connections through advertising, which is created something which can be manipulated by outsiders. And the Russians discovered this, but they're not alone. People in Macedonia were doing it to make money. So it's not just the Russians or Chinese. I mean, we created, as Niall said, a formula for financing, which was based on advertising, which means, how do I get people to click so I can sell more ads? Well, what leads to clicks is outrage. But you got to realize that the polarization was there long before there was social media. I think you can make an argument that when Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act in '64, he said, there goes the South. The solid South, which had voted continually Democratic, gradually became the solid South for Republicans. It took several decades for that to happen. But there is a recent book that looked at the 2016 election that showed that race was a deeply polarizing issue in the United States this day. And that means that when a Russian group in St. Petersburg wanted to create trouble, they created a persona, sometimes people call it a sock puppet, and it was called Blacktivist. And it showed films and pictures of black and white people hitting each other. Now, it could have been a boxing match, it could have been anything, but it was conflicts of blacks and whites. And they got more people liking that than the legitimate American site for Black Lives Matter did. So they were taking something, the polarization that's happened in our society goes all the way back to the 60s, and the cultural changes explain why it is that the people who voted in 2016, the older, whiter, male, and less educated, were strongly for Trump. I mean, this is just a demographic. And those people are people who'd lost status from when white males ruled the roost. You didn't have to worry about women, people from another race, gays. All these things have been polarizing for these people who are sometimes called economic voters. It's more cultural vote. It's a mix of the two. But it does, that polarization, which goes back to the 60s and 70s, created this opportunity for others to then take this new device that was invented here and use it as a weapon against us. So you have a problem in American society, and the Russians decided, hey, I can turn the Americans' machinery, called Google and Facebook and Twitter, into a weapon where I can take their existing problems and make it look like democracy ain't so good after all. And therefore, my authoritarian nationalist system here in Russia is pretty good in comparison. It's very orderly. So what I'm saying is completely consistent with what Niall said about in terms of the analysis of the effect of the social media, but the roots of it go much deeper into our own culture. The polarization was exacerbated by, but not created by.
Well, that would be a point that I wanted to raise with Niall, because Niall, in your opening remarks, you said there was a failure to protect democracy from the onset of this new infrastructure, and we were going to talk a bit about regulation. But Joe's comments would suggest that it's a little bit blaming the messenger, that in fact, you had this deep polarization, you've had ever-deepening polarization, that really what democracies have done is to fail to protect themselves from the trends, the political trends, the economic trends, and others that have actually caused the polarization. And now these companies come along, they have their network, this is how people get their information, and so it exacerbates an already underlying trend. And I think that would be the basis on which they would say, the social media companies, well, we don't create content, we are not publishers. What we do is we provide a platform for people to talk, to express, and this is what you get when you're a deeply polarized society. So why isn't that a proper defense today if you are a social media company? I'm putting it in very kind of black and white terms, because I think after recent events, most of them would say that they do have some responsibilities, but are they really responsible for the content that may simply be expressing a polarization that is very deep in the society?
Well, number one, it's not news that divisions in American society go back a long way, and they go a long way back beyond the 1960s. It goes right back to the very foundations of the country. But was the United States much more deeply divided in 2016 than it had been in 2012? When Barack Obama won a second term? No, it can't really have been that much more divided in the space of 4 years. I'd like to simply run a thought experiment. Well, what if the 2016 election had happened with the technology of, well, let's say 2008. Let's take it back to that first Obama victory. And I don't think that Donald Trump would have won. Because the dramatic growth in the importance of the network platforms in the intervening period created new tools that his campaign was actually better at exploiting than Hillary Clinton's campaign. Most obviously Facebook advertising, which is really the killer app in modern democracy. I mean, there are now two kinds of politician in any democracy: the ones who understand how Facebook advertising works and the ones who lose. And it was as simple as that. You can see this in all the various post-mortems that have been done of the election. In my view, the single most striking thing was that Brad Pascal and his team on the digital side for Trump were able to bring in the Facebook engineers and work extremely hard at targeting the advertising in a way that you can with Facebook. It's not just that you're targeting demographics, you're targeting individual users, taking to the next level what had begun to be done 4 years previously by the Obama campaign, and using it in a variety of ways that I think were decisive in a very close election. So I think we need to focus not so much on the long-standing polarization of the United States or the divisions of the United States on racial lines or on any other lines. We need to focus on what made 2016 different. And what made it different was that with the expenditure of relatively little money, the Trump campaign was able to overcome a massive disadvantage that it had. In financial terms, the Clinton campaign had double the money available relative to the Trump campaign. But the Trump campaign understood Facebook advertising, not to mention the president's own understanding of Twitter as a platform. So he just dominated her on these platforms. The numbers were astonishing. He was far ahead of her on Twitter, far ahead of her on Facebook, far ahead of her in Google search. And in 2016, if you were following these numbers as I was, you realized that the polls were kind of deceiving you about what was going to happen. They were leading you to expect with very high confidence that she was going to win. But no, That was the old model. People who were still using old models had missed the fact that the structure of the public sphere had fundamentally changed. This was only news if you hadn't paid attention to Brexit. But I had been on the wrong side of that debate and had realized that the reason Remain had lost and Brexit had won in the previous June was simple. That Dominic Cummings, running the Leave campaign, had understood Facebook advertising and used it very effectively. Now, the big question, which I think we may slightly differ on, is how important was foreign meddling in the 2016 elections? And I think it was not decisive. It's not enough to really have made the difference if only around ballpark 1% of content was Russian in origin. The overwhelming bulk of content on the internet relating to the 2016 election was essentially homegrown. It was user-generated. It was mostly made in America. And I think that's really what you have to look at, and you have to ask yourself, which of the two campaigns understood the significance of this new political landscape? And I think it's clear that the Trump campaign did. And if you run a bunch of counterfactuals in your head, it's hard because it was such a close election, almost any variable could be said to have made the difference. But one thing's for sure, if you imagine the 2016 election without Facebook, if you imagine it without Twitter, it's really difficult to imagine Trump winning.
Yeah, I don't think Niall and I are disagreeing all that much. I was simply going back earlier to start the division and polarization. But I say it's as though there was a fire there, and then somebody came along and poured gasoline on the fire. So I think we agree on the sources of the gasoline. But you know, one thing that's really worth emphasizing here, because I think there are lots of false narratives about 2016. If you just look at the big shift that occurred between 2012 and 2016, the most striking thing is decreased turnout of African American voters. That's the big difference. And that was partly, though, generated by some efforts, including some domestic and some Russian efforts to suppress votes.
Right. Well,
so this blacktivist kind of thing was for
it might
that
also
purpose.
have had something to do with the fact that there was an African American on the ticket in 2008.
Right.
So I think we have to be a little careful about single causal explanations here. It would be a very
that was the thing that was being really targeted. That was the kind of thing that you could use Facebook advertising for, to basically portray Hillary Clinton in a negative light to African American voters.
I fully understand that, but I'll give you a counterexample. I'm an Alabaman, and by birth, when somebody named Roy Moore ran in Alabama, actually Facebook notwithstanding, African Americans turned out in huge numbers. So I think we have to be a little bit careful with Facebook as the causal variable here. I think I would associate myself more with what Joe is saying, and I don't think it completely contradicts Niall. It's just a different emphasis. You don't have
responsibility.
But could I just finish? You don't have people. You don't have disaffection to pour flame on or to pour gasoline on if you don't have disaffection. So I think in analyzing the elections, it's important to ask what were the underlying. This is me, the political scientist. What were the underlying trends that were then exploited by either foreign or by campaigns. Every campaign tries to exploit underlying trends. It's just that social media allows you to do it much more effectively.
Connie,
and with
I
would
think
agree.
To go back to the results of the 2016 election, if it was really determined by about 80,000 votes in 3 states in the Electoral College, that is such a small difference that it's what we call overdetermined. And we could go on listing 6 things. If Hillary hadn't had a problem with private server, if Comey hadn't brought it up when he did, you can go on and on like this. But among the things that could have turned 80,000 votes was the Russian intervention. So I don't think you could say that the Russians elected Donald Trump. Jim Clapper, the former director of national intelligence, thinks that's the case. Somebody like several other high intelligence officials think that there are too many other determinants. But the point is, the Russians did accomplish one thing, which is they played on our divisions to downgrade our reputation as a successful democracy and to undercut our soft power. That they succeeded in.
Now, let me just turn to that question, because we've had a conversation here that would seem to make democracies very vulnerable, not quite up to the task of dealing with the new public square. And the authoritarians is kind of 10 feet tall in having figured it out. So let's talk a little bit about the Chinese and the Russians, not in terms of interference in American elections, but are authoritarians simply better structured to win this fight? The Chinese have taken a completely different approach to the internet. They are very clear that what they see on the internet from their citizens, there is no privacy. What they see on the internet is going to determine your social score and your patriotism score. They've been very clear with Chinese companies that you're on the team or you don't operate. So they have a very different view and approach to the internet. Do you see vulnerabilities in that, or are they playing the right game in some sense?
Well, I think in the short run, both the Russians and the Chinese have learned how to have a degree of sovereignty over the internet, which, going back to my Jello on the wall example, it shows that they can do it. I mean, they have the great firewall, they have tame companies which they can manipulate, and if that fails, they can go and knock on the door of the citizen who's tweeting or WeChatting the wrong thing and lock them up. We don't have that, fortunately. There's a vulnerability in the long run with that, which is the centralization of information leads to vulnerabilities which you might think of as large category mistakes. So the view that China has finally perfected the Orwellian world, I don't think so. I was in Beijing a few weeks ago, and I was interested in some of the people I talked to privately, and obviously not for any attribution, felt that Xi Jinping had made a big mistake in reversing Deng Xiaoping's efforts to get an orderly succession mechanism. And that he had also, because he wasn't listening enough, was mishandling the American relationship. This means that if some event occurs, untoward event, unpredicted, a ship is sunk in a battle off the Senkaku Islands, or something really does go wrong with the Chinese banking system. These are not high probability events. But if they occur, it's not clear that the system that they've developed in China is going to be properly adapted for that. And Xi may find that while he's now in strong control, there have been situations in the past, like Park Chung-hee in South Korea, who was in very tight control. He was assassinated by his intelligence chief. And over the next 8 years, the generals who followed him basically opened up the system. So I'm a little bit reluctant to say, the authoritarians have the answer. Right now, they have a tactical advantage. They've learned how to exploit some of our vulnerability. I'd still vote for openness in the end.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd agree with that. It's worth reminding ourselves that it's only a few years ago, during the Arab revolutions, that people like Jared Cohen and Eric Schmidt were arguing that the internet's favorable to democracy and it's a disaster for dictatorial regimes. And it kind of looked that way as Mubarak and others were ousted from power. I think we've kind of come almost too far to the other side in the last couple of years with the increasingly popular line that, correction, actually the internet really favors the authoritarians and it's democracy that's screwed. I mean, both of these analyses are wrong. I think it's very interesting to notice the benefits, but also the costs of the Chinese system. That this is a regime that spends more on domestic security than on national security. The investment in surveillance systems is staggering. And you don't do that if you don't, at some level, fear your own people. And what's fascinating about the way in which the internet now works in China is that very successfully they kept the American companies out. The Great Firewall of China, the systematic discrimination against the Silicon Valley companies has worked. Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent, and others have grown up. There is this parallel ecosystem. So China is a tech superpower, and it's the only rival that Silicon Valley has. And so that's a pretty impressive achievement. Europeans can only look on enviously. But when you look at what happens on China's social networks, look at, for example, the conversations on WeChat, I, like you, Joe, am always struck by how much criticism there is. So the last time I was there, which wasn't so long before you, Joe, this was at the time when Xi Jinping had just appeared at military exercises in Siberia alongside Vladimir Putin. And I was shown by a number of friends a meme that was going around on WeChat, which was a lengthy analysis of all the things that the Russians have done to China over the years and all the good things that the United States has done for China. And in that sense, no matter how much they may have nailed Jello to the wall, it's still Jello. And I'm not sure that it's right to say that they have come up with Orwell 2.0. Sure, everybody in the world now carries around their own portable telescreen and we all volunteer for surveillance. But I'm not sure that that necessarily gives the Chinese regime as much power as some commentators in the West think. Actually, in some ways, Xi Jinping's centralization of power in his own hands and the increasing surveillance technology seems to me to speak of a certain weakness and vulnerability to that regime.
With VPNs, there's an extraordinary awareness of outside news. I mean, when you talk to somebody, you find that they are up on something, and how did you find that? I didn't see that in Renmin Ribao or China Daily or anything. You know, what can I? Got a VPN, and so the Great Wall has lots of holes through it.
Yeah, absolutely.
So returning to the challenges to democracy, and then I just want to alert that we'll go out to the audience here and after some conversation about this question. What is then the road ahead? How do we think about dealing with the challenges? What is the responsibility of the government? What is the responsibility of the companies? What's the responsibility of the citizen? And then perhaps, since we're all interested in the international side, is there anything to be said for some level of international cooperation on cybersecurity and issues of this kind? So, Niall, you've been writing quite a bit on these network organizations, and you have some thoughts about their responsibility and as well as regulation from the government.
Well, I'll leave the international piece to Joe and just focus on what I'll call the domestic regulatory piece. The status quo can't be tenable. It cannot be healthy for our democracy to have the public sphere dominated by a tiny number of companies, incentivized to sell ads by maximizing user engagement by fair means or foul, and it certainly can't be right that they can accept content relating to our democratic process, relating to elections, from foreign actors. And if you think that that has been fixed in the last 2 years, I have bad news for you, because Facebook groups have continued to circulate content relating to American politics right the way through the midterms. Some fantastically good posts on this subject by Jonathan Albright on Medium, showing that the arms race, and I think that's the right way to think about it, has advanced. New techniques are being used, but there's still a fundamental problem that the system is open to foreign meddling in a way that must be corrected. Now, my suggestions in the paper are slightly different from the usual arguments that get made. I'm skeptical about antitrust. I have my doubts about the viability of breaking up the big tech companies. They're not standard data, standard oil by analogy. I think there's some regulation that needs to change, but I think it needs to focus on a number of quite narrow points, because we mustn't get into a situation where a federal agency is deciding what can and cannot appear on the internet. So I think we need to make sure that the network platforms are held to the same standards that all publishers and television are held to when it comes to political advertising. We are still not there. There is still political content going out there on the internet that isn't identified as foreign in origin, and that's the kind of thing that we have regulatory agencies to combat. But the big arguments I make in the paper are twofold. We need to look again at the exemption from liability for content that the network platforms have enjoyed since 1996 under Section 230 of the Telecommunications Act. That seems anachronistic, given that these companies are now some of the biggest in the world. And I think we also need, as they increasingly use their powers to censor or limit access to their platforms, we need to, I think, argue that the First Amendment applies in cyberspace, and there is not and should not be a regime of censorship by Facebook, Google, or any other of the network platforms. So we've got to do the following. We have to protect our political system, our public sphere, from foreign intervention, from foreign hacking. That seems clear, and that is the kind of thing that regulators should be working to do. But we also have to make sure that there is free speech, and that the rules that govern free speech in other domains apply on the internet. You can't go into a newspaper and threaten an individual with death. You can do that still on the internet. It happens a great deal of the time. But you should be able to debate all the controversial topics of the day without reverting to ad hominem threats freely, whether it's on Facebook or Google. So these are the recommendations that I'm making, and they do involve some changes because I do think that the status quo is untenable.
I wonder, though, Niall, if there isn't a kind of internal contradiction here, because you are right that a newspaper, you can't go into a newspaper and threaten and therefore perhaps cause people to go out and commit harm. But there's an intermediate step, there is an intermediary, that's called the editor. So if it's the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, they will decide their content. They have people that they've hired to write the content. They have editorial pages that do the content. If you put in an op-ed or I put in an op-ed, they can decide to accept it or not. They have control over their content. And they should therefore be liable for their content. But in social media, the content is not constructed by Facebook or by Twitter. The content is constructed externally, so how can they be held liable?
They are already, they've been liable.
No, I understand, but I'm asking you to address the contradiction here, because you also don't want them to pick and choose. You said you don't want them deciding what is hate speech or whatever. The New York Times can make that decision. So aren't they fundamentally different than the traditional media?
No, I don't think they are.
And if you give them the liability for the content, but don't give them the right to control the content, isn't that a contradiction?
I don't think it's a contradiction. And indeed, in his recent hearings in Washington, Mark Zuckerberg acknowledged that he has and feels responsibility for the content.
And I think they are changing on that very dramatically.
I think there's been a real shift in attitudes, and I think 2016 has been a wake-up call for the whole of Silicon Valley. I think that the fact that they hired 10,000 additional people to start moderating content means that they acknowledge that they need to do much more. But I think at the moment it's not transparent on what basis this occurs, because the community standards that they invoke when they decide to kick someone off the platform are not transparent. We can't even access the detailed basis on which this moderation goes on. So I think we need to try to create a balance. It's not a contradiction. It's a balance that we need to strike. And it's the same balance that television had to strike, that radio had to strike, that the newspapers had to strike. It's the classic balance of the public sphere, that you need to allow, if you believe in free speech as I do, hateful things to be said, but what you can't allow is things that lead directly to harm to individuals to be disseminated. And the Supreme Court's repeatedly ruled on that. There's a really large body of law on this that defines what goes and what doesn't go, what's acceptable and what's not acceptable in the public sphere, except that this doesn't seem to apply on the internet, which is making up its own rules as if somehow it exists in a parallel universe. My argument is, let's bring the internet, stop pretending they're not publishing content. For heaven's sake, just because there's a lot of it doesn't mean it's not getting published. Just because it's written by a whole large number of people who aren't journalists doesn't mean it's not content. The responsibility is very great. Mark Zuckerberg now likes to compare himself with Caesar Augustus. Well, with great power comes great responsibility. You've got 2.27 billion users. It's not just American democracy is screwing up. You're doing a pretty good job of screwing up most democracies at the moment, to say nothing of what's going on in places like Myanmar. So I think the responsibilities need to be firmly asserted by our democracy and by other democracies on these people. You're responsible for the content, and you need to make sure that death threats to individuals don't appear. And if that's going to cost you more money and hurt your bottom line, too bad.
So you would allow them, just to be clear, you would allow them to say, if I wish to post something on Facebook that Facebook believes is incendiary and likely to lead to harm, that doesn't get posted. Well, they have the right to do that in an editorial function.
Well, they've had that right for a long time.
No, yeah, but if you're a content provider, you also have an editorial function. So you're not uncomfortable with that, but you want to be sure that it doesn't somehow spill over into speech, so that I'm now not just talking about incendiary speech, I'm increasing the definition of what might be incendiary speech. Is that a way to think about it?
We live at a time, not least in American universities, where the term hate speech has been stretched in every direction, so that anything that anybody finds even slightly upsetting is suddenly not allowed. And that's something we have to be very wary of, especially if those kind of criteria are imported from the campus into the big technology companies. There's a clear distinction between my writing a Facebook post that threatens somebody with death or other harm, or leads them into harm. That's the kind of thing that these companies should be accountable for in the courts. And my saying something that you just find objectionable about politics that doesn't lead directly to individual harm. These are the kinds of lines that have been drawn ever since the press came into existence. One point I make in the paper is that these problems were the problems that arose when the printing press first spread through Europe in the late 15th century. They're not new problems, but the idea that because you're a technology platform, you're somehow held to different standards from traditional newspaper publishers or TV stations, I just don't see that that's a defensible position anymore. And I think it wasn't defensible all along. It only kind of got established because of the feeling that we should have a relatively light regime for these fledgling startups in the 1990s. But the fledgling startups are now the biggest corporations in the world. They should be held to account. They can't operate in a different playing field from the people who are putting together the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal.
Joe, let me ask you to respond to the international side. Is there any hope of some kind of international cooperation on these issues when you have really two very different paradigms, two sets of values undergirding those paradigms? Is there any hope for the Chinese and the Russians want an international regime? We're just not sure we like that idea.
Well, the Russians first proposed a treaty to govern information technology at the UN in 1998, and we rejected it because he said it was unverifiable. We didn't agree with the idea that they would use for it. They would control speech through it. What happened is that we agreed to a proposal for the Secretary General to set up a group of government experts. And in 2004, a UN group of government experts was created, 15 countries, with no negotiating authority. But they were given a task, and it was reconvened and met several times. By 2015, they had come up with quite an interesting set of norms for the internet and for conflict, for reducing conflict on the internet. And it was approved by the G20, which is the 20 largest economies in the world, and also by the UN General Assembly. Among the most interesting norms in that was you can't ban any particular programs. You can't ban weapons because that's meaningless in terms of the internet. But you can ban certain targets, and that's civilian targets. And we already do that. We have norms. You don't Even when you're in a war, you don't bomb a hospital, though Assad does it, but nonetheless, in general, most major states do obey these norms. So they imported these norms, which you might call the laws of armed conflict, into internet conflict and got agreement from 15 states. The problem was the Russians immediately violated it with their actions in Ukraine. The Chinese were a little better on this, and just this past week, there was a resolution passed at the UN to reconvene the group of government experts, which in 2017 had failed. I mean, they tried to reconvene in 2017, it failed. Now they've gotten agreement to give it another 2 years. What's interesting about this is that our general view is, it's often say, you know, the WWW stands for World Wild West. But it's not. There are actually some norms, just as in the Wild West, there were certain norms where when you went beyond a certain boundary, you got into trouble, and how many cattle you rustled or whatever. So there is a prospect for norms which states will obey out of self-interest. And I've written a paper on this, of normative restraints on cyber conflict. And the interesting aspect of it is, you ask, why do states sometimes agree to norms and are bound by them? And it comes out of prudence, it comes out of reputation, it comes out of internalization of norms in different publics, which is how we have seen a number of norms develop. So I think there will be gradual development of norms. Right now, the major problem is the Russians and the Chinese are fixed on sovereignty as the basic norm. I think what you're going to wind up with is that there'll be areas of the internet, like Russia, China, and other authoritarian states, where they will control things. The key question is, will they be able to use their systems to interfere in ours? So Niall was mentioned earlier about a Westphalian treaty. I don't think we'll ever get a treaty, but you can imagine a development of certain norms, and different states will run their internal internet in different ways. You're seeing this with a lot more legislation on data localization that's causing this so-called splinter net. But it doesn't mean you won't still have connections. China has the Great Firewall, but we connect with China a lot. And it's very important for commerce. We can work with China on criminal cases. I mean, people who are using bank fraud or cards and so forth. So it's not true that there are no norms. Right now, the hard part is that the Russians, Putin is a spoiler. The Russians have found a way to misuse our system to do their spoiling. And what I proposed in my paper is, don't try to write a treaty with them. That's not going to work. But you could get something like a rules of the road to prevent escalation. And we did this with the Soviets in 1972. We got an agreement called Incidents at Sea, in which the two navies agreed that as they shadowed each other, they weren't going to come closer than a certain range. You could imagine something where the Russians and the Americans each made a unilateral declaration. Here's the limits of what we think is legitimate interference in your political process, and you make the same about ours. And then we set up a consultative process in which we say, wait, you got too close. That went over the limit. If you keep this up, we're going to use certain measures against you. And there are measures we can take, like closing down certain Russian bank accounts. The money simply vanishes. So there are things we can do to punish them if they were to cross the lines. And I think what we ought to do is keep working on this process of gradually developing norms that will be shared by a lot of states. But these norms take sometimes 2 decades or more to really take root. And they also come not just from the UN, but from private groups. I'm a member of a something called the Global Commission on Stability in Cyberspace, which is chaired by the former Estonian foreign minister and has Mike Chertoff, our former Secretary of Homeland Security, as the deputy chairman. And they're trying to establish a set of norms as a non-governmental group to supplement the UN group. This is what the process is going to be. It's going to take, there are going to be many norm entrepreneurs. It's going to take quite some time, but it's not going to be WWW, meaning Wild West. It's going to be gradual, but in the meantime, there's one particular bad guy in town, and we've got to say to him, you cross this pasture or this river and rustle our cattle, let me tell you what's going to happen to your bank account in Switzerland, or something like that.
All right, we've come to the time where we'd like to open up the discussion, and so there will be mics, and I see a hand right beside you, sir, and then if somebody can get a mic to this gentleman down here.
I'm a student within the Master of International Policy program here. As a Frenchman, one of the things that surprised me the most when I arrived in this country was the fact that people spoke of communities in the plural and not of a society when speaking about politics. I would argue that social media and network platforms push this even further by isolating these communities online in a way. I was wondering whether you think that it is desirable, and if yes, whether this trend that makes the political landscape more and more atomized into single elements that don't really speak to each other, whether this trend can be reversed. Yes, because I think that one of the biggest importance to democracy is that people are able to actually speak to each other within a single society. Thank you.
Neil, you want to start?
There's no doubt that the fragmentation of American society by identity politics has become somehow more acute, even in the time that I've been working and living in this country. And I'm afraid that the advent of network platforms has made this tendency worse. There's a paradox, though, which is that as they were being built, the network platforms promised us something even better than the national society that you've just spoken of, which is rather a French idea, and that is a global community. Mark Zuckerberg's favorite phrase for a time was global community, and he used to argue that the mission of Facebook was to build a global community. And it seemed at the time very persuasive. Wouldn't it be wonderful if the whole world was connected and that we would be able to communicate with everybody, even through VPNs with our friends in China? What 2016 did was to reveal the hollowness of the promise, or rather the ambiguity of a connected world. And this was one of the central themes of my book on the subject, The Square and the Tower, that precisely because of the existence of giant online social networks, we expose the divisions more clearly than perhaps had been the case before. It's not that surprising because of the phenomenon of homophily, which is just the phenomenon of birds of a feather flocking together. Even in a network the size of the people in this room, if we were to graph the network, we would find some elements of polarization, even self-segregation in the loosest sense, because that's the way social networks operate. We've known that since research by sociologists on networks of friends in American high schools back in the 1970s. So I think what happens when you build giant online networks is that you reveal that in reality, any society subdivides into clusters, whether they be ideological or even racial. What the internet has done, I think, and particularly what the network platforms do, is they throw this into bold relief, and then they accentuate it for the reasons that we've been discussing. And let's face it, that happens in France too. It happens in every European country. It's happened in Brazil. One of the things that most strikes me when I look around the world is that the phenomena that we experienced in the United States in 2016 and continue to experience are happening elsewhere, even in places with quite different cultural histories from ours. Europe has its populism. Europe has its its abuse and use of Facebook and Twitter. Asia is a place where WhatsApp is being used and used in ways that are often extremely harmful. So I don't think that this is a peculiar American phenomenon. I think identity politics is becoming the standard form of politics in the networked age in almost every country.
Of course,
I just add something, which is, you are absolutely right that the American philosophy of government is different. There's no Rousseau with a concept of a general will in the United States. We have a tradition from James Madison, which is best in the Federalist paper. If you haven't read them, I'd suggest it's crucial, in which he says, faction balances faction. We don't try to get everybody to be exactly the same. We want divided government. We want to preserve liberty. So the general will, the one community, has not been part of our ideology as a government right from the start. So there's nothing new about that. What's different, though, is that when the internet made it possible to connect everybody, it didn't create a global village. It created connections, some of which are good and some of which are bad. If you were a gay in Utah in pre-internet period, you felt isolated, lonely, nobody was like you. And then with the internet, you could get a support group where there's somebody in Toronto or in Paris or elsewhere, and you suddenly felt not so isolated and not so lonely. That's a good thing. But it's also true that it connected very bad people. As somebody once put it, throughout history, every village has had an idiot. Now the internet has connected all the village idiots.
Right here in front.
Thank you so much for this engaging conversation. I'm Abu Zar. I'm in first year Master's in International Policy, and I'm from Afghanistan. So my question is that it was mentioned that we can think of Facebook as a sort of a publication that should be regulated, that they should be held accountable. Now, in the US, you wouldn't want Fox News or New York Times to regulate everything that's been published. Now, with Facebook, if you think of it internationally, do you want an algorithm that's developed in California to dictate what free speech looks like in, say, Afghanistan or another country? How do you make sure that this is not a new form of colonialism, quote unquote? Good. So how do you deal with this?
Thank you. Question. Yes.
Well, it's a great question, because if you think Facebook has played a problematic role in the United States' politics over the last couple of years, let me take you to Asia and show you some really troubling things. The worst stories don't relate to Afghanistan. They relate to Burma, Myanmar, and indeed India, where what one sees is the weaponization of social media to promote political violence along communal, along religious lines. And the recent reports on Facebook's role in Myanmar, not least in the New York Times, have made for some pretty disturbing reading, not least because they highlight the company's relatively sluggish response to the complaints by civil society and foreign groups observing what was happening to the Rohingya. So I think there's a global problem here, and you're right to pose the question, is this kind of some new imperialism? That's the right question to ask of people who liken themselves to Caesar Augustus. This is a vast empire that now extends into more or less every country in the world, with the notable exception of China. And it operates nominally as a global community, in reality as a US company. The Europeans have a response to this, which is more subtle than the Chinese Great Firewall. The European response is, we're going to tax you, we're going to fine you, we are going to regulate you. And the European Commission has moved a great deal faster than the federal government of the United States to try and create some regulatory framework. Now, I think mistakes are being made in Europe. Increasingly, the mentality, which I see as essentially the German view, is that the German government is going to say what hate speech is, and if Facebook doesn't prevent it appearing in Germany, then they're going to hit them with fines. But what you then do is you give Facebook the role of censorship Inc. And that's not the way that we would want that, I think, to happen in the United States, which is why I'm trying to argue for a First Amendment type regime where they really aren't in a position of acting as censor on behalf of anybody. I think every country in the world is going to have to create standards applicable to its own needs. In that sense, we are going to have to shatter the illusion of global community. Because what Facebook can do in an emerging market, in a developing country, can often be extraordinarily destabilizing. Even in Latin America, we see this kind of phenomenon. The recent Brazilian election was fascinating because of the way WhatsApp was used with considerable effectiveness by the Bolsonaro campaign. It's a very hard thing to monitor because of the encryption that's central to WhatsApp's appeal. So this isn't just a problem for Afghanistan. This is a problem for every country that is trying to hold elections. You have the simultaneous problem that domestic political entrepreneurs who figured out the technology have an innate advantage, especially if they're unscrupulous enough as to use it in the ways that I've been describing. But you also have the problem that foreign actors can play in your politics way more easily than used to be true. So it's very important in this discussion that we not be too Americana-centric. Yeah, these problems kind of are made in America, made in Silicon Valley, but they're now global problems and they confront pretty much every country.
I just want to comment, though, we keep saying that Facebook has done this and Bolsonaro was not created by Facebook. Bolsonaro was created by a Brazilian system that has, over the last several years, produced governments that were unable to deliver, governments, by the way, that I was quite fond of, like Lula, but governments that were tainted by corruption, and governments that were therefore very susceptible and very vulnerable to a populist push from the right. Now, the argument that these platforms make it much more efficient for a Bolsonaro to come to power in Brazil, but I think we have to be very careful to get the causal arrow going in the right direction here. Because we can regulate what Facebook does and what Twitter does until the cows come home, but if the underlying problems are still there, people will find a way to exploit them and to exploit them effectively. And by the way, the idea that we want each country to set its own standards makes the hair on the back of my neck go up just a little bit, because there is, I think, an American, maybe it's a uniquely American, I don't think so, an American preference for people around the world having the ability to govern themselves, to speak for themselves, and to the degree that you start allowing the turkeys of the world, for instance, to set their own standards for the internet, you are empowering a certain kind of regime in those countries. So this is a very complex set of problems. But by the way, I'm very glad to see you here from Afghanistan. I have to say that. So I'm just arguing for a more complex argument than it's really the technology. The technology is clearly an accelerant, an exacerbating factor, but that's not what caused the election in Brazil.
Let me respond to that, Conde, because it's a really important point. I don't disagree with you. It's just that I see people still around the world underestimating the dramatic change in the public sphere that has occurred. I was in Sao Paulo in April, and I gave a talk in which I said, Bolsonaro is going to win your election. And everybody just said, Neil, what do you know? He's not going to win. He's just some kind of maverick. Don't worry. We've got it figured out. You know, we have a centrist guy. His name is Alckmin, and he'll get it in the second round. Chill. And I said, no, you don't understand. Because if you just look at the follower numbers that Bolsonaro has already in April on Facebook and on Twitter, he's out of sight. And between then and the election, he added followers far more rapidly on those platforms than any other candidate. So you've got to recognize that a massive shift in the structure of the public sphere has occurred in every democracy, and indeed in authoritarian states too. I mean, this is only a story that applies, it doesn't apply to North Korea, but it applies practically everywhere else. It even applies in authoritarian regimes. So I think we need to accentuate and emphasize the scale of the shift so that people don't underestimate it. I'm still struck by how many people I encounter around the world. I was just in New Zealand. They're like, nah, this isn't going to happen here. Nah, forget it. And of course it's going to happen there, because it's going to happen everywhere.
Of course it's going to happen, but it's because the disaffection is also very deep. And that's the piece that I think we have to stay focused on. I have one, too.
Hi, my name is Lisa Einstein. I'm also a first-year's Master's in International Policy student here. It seems like from everything you're saying, one of the main issues is Facebook's business model of engagement. And I was wondering if either of you have any alternative ideas.
Well, let's not focus quite so heavily on Facebook. There was a study recently done in Germany of YouTube, which is part of Google, and it found that the same algorithms, which mean the more clicks, the more advertisements, the more money, those algorithms took a series of events, unbeknownst or unintended by somebody sitting in California, and drew out a very, very far right conclusion. So you were fed material to take you further and further to the right. So let's not blame Mark Zuckerberg alone. I mean, the point is that the model which emphasizes getting attention produces algorithms which, by their own working, will drive toward the extremes. One of the things I suggest in my paper, which is an idea that is suggested by the London Economist, is that the companies, the social media companies, ought to be responsible for these algorithms. You don't have to give the whole algorithm, which gives away your secret sauce, but you should have an advisory board with public representation which can check on these algorithms, and there should be also a right of appeal if things are taken down the wrong way. So it's a little bit different from, my answer is a little bit different from Niall's in the sense that I don't think it's a bad thing that Facebook and Google and Twitter take things down. I want them to take things down, and just like a private university doesn't have to be bound by all the details of the First Amendment, but can choose to do there. So I'd like to have the companies take down incitement in Germany or incitement in Myanmar and other such things. But I'd like to have some process in which this is more transparent or more accountable. You might have to set up something like the FISA courts that are, a procedure in which on intelligence information, there's a special court which is composed of judges from ordinary courts, but sitting in a special arrangement. I think my view of this is I don't want the government censoring, but I don't object to Facebook or Google or Twitter taking things down, but I don't want them to do it without some form of accountability. And I'd like to have them have to act the way a university does, will act as if we were governed by the First Amendment. We had this debate at Harvard some years ago in which we said we're not subject to the First Amendment, we'll act as if we were. But it gives you a degree of leeway. So it's close to Niall, but it's not exactly the same.
I don't mind that. Can I just add a very quick word? I know we're running out of time, but there are other business models. Wikipedia doesn't sell ads. The Wall Street Journal is a subscription-based model. You've got to decide as a citizen, where do you want to get your news from? And if you want to get it from Facebook's news feed, then my strong advice is change your business model, because that is not a good source for news.
Comment, yes.
Hi, I'm an undergraduate in the classics department. Cyber warfare and information warfare seems, by nature of its intangibility and complexity, particularly prone to misunderstanding by the general populace or partisan manipulation about exactly what has happened. So can you talk about how governments can adequately communicate to their citizens about cyber warfare and information warfare in order to avoid the sort of partisan manipulation we've seen, for example, in something like the 2016 election regarding what exactly happened?
Thank you. I'm going to take a couple of questions here. The young lady right behind you, and then we'll wrap up after the questions. Yes.
Hi, I'm Kayla Grunick, and I work at the Moderator project. My question is your opinion on the dark web and the deep web's influence on the political sphere, and if we add potentially too many regulations to these social media companies, if users will turn to these much more unregulated technologies, what will happen?
Okay, I'm going to take one final question. The gentleman here in the middle.
Sure. Red Niall, hi, also in the international policy program here. We talked about, so let's say, in offline societies, when people do things that violate our norms, even if they're not illegal, we have recourse. We can shun them and drive them to the edges of our society. That seems to not work as well with online societies, and it especially seems not to work as well when people in very influential positions exercise norm violation, without consequence. So I wonder if you think that there's something more that as a society we need to be doing to kind of preserve the norms that we have left with regards to expression online.
Joe, let me ask you to...
Let Neil go first on this one.
Okay, but I was going to ask you to take particularly the question on cyber warfare and how governments might respond to their citizens. So, yes.
Well, I think it's essential that you get not just governments, but a broad-based effort to educate citizens about what these problems are. And there are various nonprofit organizations that are working on this. Harvard has a group who are working on training election officials. There are groups who are working with the press to improve their study. The more you can increase consciousness of what's going on, the better you can inoculate. The French did this relatively well before the Macron election. And it's interesting to me, just to use a little trivial example, the Russian project for this election, the midterm, was they didn't want to interfere in the election as much as they wanted the reputation for interfering in it. In other words, if you want to corrupt democracy, you don't have to actually do anything. You just have to get everybody believe that the system was corrupted. So every time a newspaper posted an article or printed an article about how the Russians had corrupted the 2018 election, that was what the Russians wanted. What's interesting is that because the press had been schooled on this, they didn't fall for it. And you didn't find a lot of articles about the Russians corrupting the election. We've got to be working across the board, and it can't be just the government, on getting a better consciousness about how this cyber warfare works and not falling for the bait. Now, it's never going to be perfect. It's always going to be there, but it's going to take constant monitoring. And the government is part of it, and government campaigns are part of it, but it's got to be out in civil society. So that's why something like this session here at Stanford and the efforts to try to get attention to it, get people start thinking about it, is so important. And it's got to be much broader based than it is now.
Yeah. Neil.
The question of the dark web is a good one. The reason that I strongly favor a First Amendment or First Amendment-like regime on the network platforms is precisely that. If there is more systematic censorship, if the community standards turn out to mean that anything that Silicon Valley liberals regard as hate speech is going to be kicked off the platforms, then for sure it's all going to end up in less salubrious places, but it's still going to be accessible. It's not like Alex Jones disappeared when they decided to kick him off the platforms. You can still access his InfoWars in a whole bunch of different ways via pages and groups. So I think that this is an extremely important point of a general nature. There is clearly some regulatory tweaking that needs to be undertaken, particularly when it comes to securing the political process from outside interference. But I don't think regulation should get into the question of what is permissible content. I think as far as possible, we want the public sphere, whether it's online or what we're doing here, to be a place where there is authentic free speech, and I will defend to the death the right of anybody in this room to say something that I completely disagree with. That's what an open society is about. This brings me to the third question that was asked about norm violation in online communities. It does feel, particularly on Twitter, as if a vast urinal wall has been created in which people can say the worst things that occur to them that they would never previously have said anywhere. Pre-internet, and for the younger members of the audience, I'm now going to invite you to take a trip on my time machine. Pre-internet, if you made a statement in the public sphere, if you wrote an article, you would get a few letters written in green ink. And those people, I guess they were your village idiots, always used green ink and often wrote in capital letters. And they would say terrible things in their letter. And you'd take the letter, you'd crumple it up, and you would throw it in the bin. Those people now have Twitter. And they can have as many accounts as they like. And they can say they're repellent things, and somehow they're even more repellent than they were before. So it's almost as if Twitter is the norm violation app. This is the place you go to violate norms, and presidents can participate in this process. What can we do, you asked? Well, I think what we can do in our non-virtual academic communities is encourage amongst our students and indeed faculty the correct mode of discourse in a civilized open society, which is that there should not be topics that are off limits, but there are modes of discourse that are off limits. And what we want, and we're giving a little bit of an example of this here, is civil debate on all the issues, including and perhaps particularly the most sensitive issues. We're not going to get that on Twitter. I doubt we're going to get it on Facebook, but we can at least get it at Stanford.
With that, I will thank Niall and Joe for a stimulating discussion, and I'll thank all of you for attending and for your participation. Thanks very much.